It says we're live, so we've got to trust that that's the case.
Right.
Fingers crossed, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to Brain Food Live on air. This is a Brain Food Live special, and it's not only a special, it's a special because it's a rearranged Brain Food Live. We had to do a kind of a rearrangement on this, so we were meant to do this, I think, 2 weeks or so ago, but delighted to bring it back to us because it's a really interesting bit of proprietary research that our guests have done on a really important part of the recruiting process, which is, of course, the interview. Now, folks, if you didn't know before, interview intelligence is the idea that we need to actually get underneath sort of what is going on at interviews. It's always been one of those black box sort of periods in the episodes in the recruiting process. Two folks go into a room. We don't know what happens in there. We have two bits of feedback when they both emerge, and we just have to guess as to what's going on. Interview intelligence is one of those categories which has really exploded the last 12 months, led by companies like BrightHire, who have basically unopened that box and allowed us to peer in what's going on. So delighted to bring this show with us and delighted to have two of the core BrightHire team with us. So let's do some intros. Ben Sessa, why don't you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Yeah, I'm Ben Sesser. I'm the co-founder and CEO of BrightHire. Founded the company 6 years ago. And what do? I try to be helpful for all the other talented people in BrightHire, like William.
Fantastic stuff. William?
Hi, William Leeds. I'm the head of data science at BrightHire. It's great to be here.
Fantastic stuff. And folks, we've got a really interesting session today because we're going to actually go down and dig into some of the research. I think this was inspired actually by a post you put out, Ben, where you talked about, hey, we did this with Harvard Business Review, and it was like, wow, we need to talk about this in a bit more depth. So I wonder whether you could put a bit of context for the audience here. What is this bit of research, and how did you interact with the HBR?
Yeah, I can give the high level, and then William can get into the methodology, or maybe once we share the slides. But a very high level. We built BrightHire because we're all really passionate about solving the problem of hiring is among the most important activities for every company's success, and it's a really important inflection point for a person, right? It like changes the trajectory of their life. And so, how do we make that interaction as excellent as possible? So our mission is to give everyone the hiring experience they deserve. And so along the way, we haven't just built like technology around that with our platform. That's the objective of what we built, but we look at data and we try to learn and sort of share insight to the world. One of the topics that we've been talking about for a long time and thinking about is just some folks call it skills-based hiring, others will call it structured hiring, but just the idea of making the interview process more objective and about the necessary skills and requirements for a role, and less of a vibe check, so to speak. And William and I have talked for a long time about looking at job descriptions as an interesting asset, right? So job description is essentially it's a message to the world, to all the potential candidates, of what matters for a given role. Like, what are the important skills, experiences, qualifications required, and people are basically filtering themselves in and out, essentially, based on that. And so the starting question was, I wonder how accurately that reflects what folks are actually going to be evaluated for during the interview process. If that's a really important signal to the world, that signal should ideally reflect the areas that are ultimately covered. And at the same time, you're understanding, are hiring teams consistently covering the things that we think are most important, right? So that was kind of the impetus for doing the research. And in terms of how it kind of transpired into the output, we got connected with this gentleman, Joseph Fuller, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. He runs their Future of Work project and has done some also interesting research in this general realm. And so we told them a little bit about what we were working on, and ended up collaborating with him and pretty closely on the research and kind of the analysis, and ultimately, was lucky enough to get it published in Harvard Business Review.
Yeah, fantastic. So let me just reiterate this. Basically, the job description, it's a key artifact in recruiting. It's basically a company saying, we are looking for these types of things. We're going to put as much content in there as possible so that people outside can understand what we're looking for. And then we're going to measure that against how we're interviewing. Are we interviewing against these things, or are we just randomly talking about stuff that's off beam, or how close are we, and what have you? Very, very interesting. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I was just saying I would add there was a couple other items that we were ultimately able to look at in conjunction. So one is just really understanding the pattern of assessment within interviews. So for instance, we also are able to look at, how deeply or broadly we're covering key skills and qualifications, how repetitive is the assessment. And then we double clicked. Actually, it was at the same time, one of the topics that we were really interested in, which we'll talk about for a minute, is AI. Everyone is talking about how AI is going to change business, and it will, like very foundationally for every organization, every job. And so the question was, well, are folks actually even assessing or understanding candidates' experiences or qualifications with respect to AI? Is that something that people are doing yet, given all the chatter? And so that was another kind of thing that we looked at in the context of this.
Yeah, and just thinking about this goes sort of, there's so many more ways we can go. So for instance, let's imagine in future there may be an AI interviewer. How does that then compare to a human interviewer over at scale? Like, is it better, worse? What does it focus on? All those things kind of emerge. Okay, let's go to you quickly, William. From a data science perspective, how can you just give us again high level, like how do you tackle a problem like this? What were the considerations that you had to get in to make sure that the conclusions that you had were robust?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of like overall evaluation of any methodology that comes in, but we had effectively kind of three big buckets of work that had to be done. One is something that'll actually parse a job description, so it can go through, read over a job description and parse the necessary set of skills that show up there. And so that could be anything from a sort of a technical skill, Python, CRM proficiency, etc. Soft skills, like how are you at collaboration and teamwork? What are some of the job responsibilities you have? Do you build dashboards day in and day out? So being able to do that well is kind of one key bucket. The next is being able to go through these interview transcripts and be able to identify, based on that job description, was this skill covered at all during this talk? And then we went one step deeper, as Ben had mentioned, which was really interesting, which is how deep was it covered? And so can you go in and like really be able to assess that something was mentioned or partially covered and well covered? And it's always easiest to do that with an example. Like a mention would be, I'm a statistician, so I'll mention SQL. You use SQL, right? Yeah, I do. Great, moving on. That would be kind of mentioning in an interview. Partial coverage might be an interviewer saying, can you tell me about a time you used SQL for a project? Candidate gives a sort of generic answer, and then the interviewer says, great, moving on. And then well covered, which is, can you tell me about a time you use SQL? And then the candidate starts answering, and the recruiter or the interviewer says, how big was your data set? What was the business problem you were trying to solve with this? If you were going to do this over, what might you do to optimize your approach? And actually going many, many levels deeper to really be able to kind of, I think, I was looking about like shrinking the amount of uncertainty you have about a candidate's effectiveness in a given area. So like
Yeah,
each of those has its kind of own level of unique models and solutions to be able to kind of address in that needed evaluation.
okay, I really love that, folks. Just to people sort of watching this, I hope you understand sort of how that sort of how the research was constructed. So basically, was it mentioned at all? I mean, a lot of stuff just gets skipped. I remember back in my interviewing days, I was obviously not a very good interviewer. I would just, there'd be assumptions made, right? Oh, this person worked in this company. They must be great at that. Let's just move on. And how much of that you simply don't even mention when you should. Secondly, at the lowest level, it's basically you ask the question, but you then skip. A yes, no will do on the response, and there's no depth there. You just move on. And then it's all the granular level. Like, is there dialogue? Is there the two? Is there a response at length? Does the terminology get repeated? Are there follow-up questions? And that basically gives you an idea. Look, it was actually covered. William, to be clear, we're not talking about whether the candidate has answered it well or not, right? We're not saying this is not what. Yeah, we're just talking about whether the interviews covered it rather than.
Yeah, the outcome would be like the strongest signal possible about understanding the candidate's capabilities.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
By the way, folks,
And then
you
the
can
other,
also go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, like, and then I think part of your question, Hung, was around the data set or the data itself. And so to click on that, I don't know, William, if you want to just talk about like the data,
Yeah,
actual
we can
sample
kind of
size.
go through, we obviously have millions of interviews. In this case, we did a deep dive into over 20,000 actual interview transcripts around over 40 companies. And these all run the gamut from small, like high growth companies all the way up to enterprise companies. Also across different industries. It could be SaaS, fintech, healthcare, professional services. And the roles themselves actually range from, entry level positions all the way to some executive roles that are included in there. So these results were typically consistent across that, but it's a really diverse and interesting data set to be able to look at.
Yeah, we're going to dig into that. I'm very interested to know whether there's variance in terms of the types of role. There has to be, right? I mean, in terms of how people get interviewed, how senior they are, and what sectors and so on. So that's going to be fascinating. I hope we dive into that. But folks, for you guys listening, watching this, you can also treat this as like interview training as well. It's like you might have forgotten a lot about how you do the job of interviewing. I know we all get lazy. We all, it goes into the subconscious. Of course, you know how to do interviews. You've done 10,000 of them, but sometimes you pick up some bad habits. Like, do you know you need to ask follow-up questions on this particular thing? So this can also be very useful for you in this regard. Okay, let's do some screen sharing because we've got a little presentation which I think just highlighting some stuff with regards to the work that BrightHire have done. Hang on, let's see whether I can do this without freaking out. Okay, you see my screen okay, folks?
Yeah.
Yes, no?
I can.
Yep, okay. So the tricky thing with me driving this, guys, is that basically I can't see what's happening on the screen, as in here. So let's just flick back. Yes, I can see it. Okay, cool. So let's go through this. Hang on, where are we? Go right at the top. Sorry, guys. Right, here we go. Are we sharing full screen? We are, aren't we? Okay, cool. I'm just going to fly through this, guys. I don't know, Ben, whether you want to say anything about this?
No, I mean, I kind of already touched on it. Just as there's a couple slides that were just the background of the company.
Okay, so this is basically some overview on BrightHire. So obviously a leading player within the field and some fantastic companies working for the organization. Worth sitting on this slide a little bit. 4 million interviews. That's crazy. Do you guys have a ticket, some sort of ticker in the business where you count how many interviews are actually conducted in real time?
Yes. Yes. Actually, a number we pay, I'd say, equally attention to is how many people get hired is something, we don't have full visibility to 100% of those, but definitely that's something that motivates our team tremendously is how many folks ultimately go through an interview process on BrightHire and get hired. Because, our objective is to support a more objective, better interviewing experience for everyone. And so that's a cool number that we track quite closely.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's have a celebration when you guys hit 5 million. I mean, it can't be too long now, right? What's the estimated time when you hit 5 million interviews, Ben?
That's a great question. They're growing like 20% month on month. Like the number of monthly interviews are growing like 20% month on month, which is if you compound that, it's a pretty high growth rate. But I don't know. I'll have to go back and do the math. William will crunch the numbers for us after this meeting.
Yeah, there should be a celebration. Okay, let's move on. And here we go with, actually, it might be worth sitting on this a little bit. So there's some new product diversification you guys have come up with, haven't you? So I wonder whether you could just touch on some of these points real quick, Ben.
Yeah, just to be brief. So, we created the category of interview intelligence 6 years ago. So it was quite a while ago, pre-COVID. So the starting point of our product was hiring conversations are really important and drive all the outcomes. So we should capture them so that we have a perfect memory. We can share context and make good decisions, and we can have data about what's happening so we can continuously improve. And over time, we've broadened out our platform pretty significantly from the whole intake upfront process of scoping new roles, building job descriptions, creating structured interview plans, which is relevant for what we're talking about today, to running great interviews across the organization that are more structured, capturing, automating, recording them, transcribing them, generating, purpose-built interview notes, through facilitating better decision making by gathering great data about every candidate, understanding what we covered or what we didn't, and then ultimately gathering a whole bunch of insights about what's happening in the process, but also some tools that help companies scale exceptional interviewing. So we have an agent, for instance, now that will coach interviewers and give them one-to-one feedback based on the actual interviews they run. And so our newest product is a product called Screen. It sits between sort of application and first live interview, and it's an AI interviewer. It's a two-way dynamic conversation that I think of as an extension of the recruiting team, actually an extension of the application, quite frankly. In a world where every resume is kind of similar or more similar because of AI, and a lot of great talent doesn't get their resume reviewed because there's so much application volume. How do we open the opportunity for more folks to share their story in a more robust way, and then spend time with the best fit, most qualified candidates ultimately, and hopefully open up the opportunity for new folks to get into a process that may not get into the process otherwise because there's so much finite time that recruiting teams have. So just launched it, kind of pretty excited about it, and kind of relevant for this conversation in the sense of like, to your point, Hung, AI is very good at running a very structured and very objective conversation, like relative to live conversations. It's going to cover the things that it should cover, and it should gather great data around that. So anyway, won't spend too much time on that, but that's the overview. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. And by the way, this is worth bearing in mind. Essentially, the stronger the filtration technology that you have, and I know some people don't like to use the term, so maybe I'd rephrase it. But the stronger the sort of the screening type of software you have, the more people you can bring at top of funnel. So it should be a way in which we can get different types of people, more different populations into the recruiting process rather than making arbitrary decisions based on CVs. So okay, let's move on to the research here. Will, you might need to guide us a little bit. Can you talk us through a little bit of this slide? What do you mean by this?
Yeah, and I think Ben touched on this as well, like kind of early on. It's like, what were we trying to best understand? And it's really, our interviewers evaluating against the skills that actually matter most for the job. And like our proxy for us for what matters most is, what are you listing in that job description? So very simply put, are the things that are mentioned in a job description covered in interviews, and what is the depth with which they're covered?
Yeah, and the counter is, are the things in the job description the most important things, right? So it's actually like a two-way analysis, because ultimately, if a lot of things in the job description aren't covered, that also might imply that you're not, the signals that you're sending to the market, to the candidates, are noisy. You're highlighting a whole bunch of things that maybe ultimately aren't that important, and people are excluding themselves because they lack those skills or qualifications, which is precluding people from stepping forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so here's the scope. Let's have a little bit of a review of this. So 23, how did you select this? So we know that you guys have done 4 million interviews, for instance. So how did you boil that down to 23K? Like, what was the process there?
Yeah, there's obviously a sampling methodology that goes in to make sure you have a diverse sample, that you're not overrepresenting certain organizations or positions, et cetera. And then part of the reason that we kind of capped the number was it was sufficient to be able to kind of answer the question we were looking at, and also cost. We were running like lots and lots of evaluations and models in a way that is that we were just so we had like kind of a dollar amount we were shooting for there. But there's really just in this case the desire to have like the minimal sample size that's representative and helps us answer the questions we needed.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, and we talked a little bit about this, but let's kind of underline. Here's the methodology. So talk through this, Will. The job descriptions are basically produced by the customers, right? So you guys are not actually, maybe not. I mean, did you guys generate the job descriptions from intake or what?
No, these are coming from customers.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the question asking is, we do have like tools to support that, but we didn't really delineate between like, did we create it or did the customer create it? We don't really, we're pulling it from the applicant tracking system, so we don't really know like what the origin of it is.
Yeah, no worries. And again, in step 2, locate skills evidence. So this is based on the interviewer asking the question. So we've got the transcription of the question, and we've also got the candidate response. and we can track whether there's been dialogue on that particular topic.
Well,
And sorry.
an interesting point there, Hung, is like we're not necessarily just looking at the interviewer questions. We're looking at the entirety of the conversation. There's actually like an important distinction there between something being covered, something might get covered organically, right? Not based on an interviewer asking a question. And actually, we have some like kind of interesting tidbits related to that. So we're actually just looking at the entirety of the conversation to understand like what topics are even discussed. We also looked at how did it arise? How did the topic actually arise? But we're not solely looking at like interviewer questions.
Right, interesting. So potentially someone could talk around the topic in an indirect way, and it brushes on the edges of the topic, and the technology is sufficient enough to understand that that's where we're pouring towards.
We're able to use like William's example from earlier. You might ask a question that's like, tell me about your general experience. And in the context of that, William might say, yeah, and I've been heavily using SQL. So SQL did come up. The interviewer did not explicitly ask about it, but the topic arose. And so we're looking at everything. And then we double clicked into how did the topic actually arise to understand that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And folks, step 3, if you can see on the screen, this is actually the interview sort of training part. If you're recruiting for set of skills, or you're actually just sort of coaching hiring managers, this might actually turn into a very nice scorecard. Is it mentioned? Is it not mentioned? Is it partially covered? Is it well covered? That I think is a very good heuristic, so to say, just a very nice way to think about are we doing the right job when it comes down to asking questions. Fantastic. Okay, so let's get to the good bit. What does the data tell us? William, I'm in your hands, man. What does this chart tell us?
Yeah, and I'm sure Ben can hop in here too. But I think one of the things that was really interesting is surface level when we first pulled these results, and we hadn't actually like really looked at just the depth of coverage, and we said, what's the likelihood that something is just mentioned? You see what seems like a very systematic interview process where after 2 interviews, roughly 90% of the skills from a job description are at least mentioned. However, when you go deeper and you say, okay, what percentage of these skills are really truly assessed according to the rubric we have, it's a completely different story where you're seeing, by the end of 5 rounds of interviews, a candidate typically has had maybe 2/3 of those skills like really well covered. And that varies across soft skills, technical skills, and experience requirements as well, with like technical skills being even less than 2/3 of those technical skills, closer to 1/2 of the technical skills. So, 5 interviews deep, you still don't have a real complete signal with respect to the candidate.
Yeah. So if you look at the chart, the top of those bars is all, any level of coverage, is being reflected. So you see the first bar is almost, 80%, second one's north of 90, then it gets, into the upper 90s by, 3, 4, 5. The middle color, the lighter blue is if it's just partially covered, like, so to William's example, tell me about a time, tell me about, like, have you ever used SQL? Yeah, I've used SQL pretty extensively. Like, it's covered, but not that in depth, versus like a lot of back and forth. And so the dark blue or purple color is well covered. So there's like an actual in-depth evaluation or in-depth discussion around those particular, skills, qualifications, et cetera. And so you see, after one interview, maybe not a surprise, it's like a recruiter phone screen potentially that's covering a whole bunch of other things. It's like 30%, but even after again, to William's point, 5 interviews, we're just north of 60% of the items that are listed in the job description as like an important skill, qualification, experience being well covered.
Was this surprising to you guys? Or did you have no fixed expectation before you did the research, or, how did you feel when this?
Well, I'll tell you my story. So William pulled the numbers, and initially it was like 80% of skills are covered after one interview and 90 something or after 2. And I was like, this cannot be right. Like, there's no way that can be accurate, just like from a time perspective, just based on what we know about, interviewing frequently. And so that's where we started to peel back the onion and do these like really, really more extensive analyses around like depth of coverage to tune that in. and then like the true picture kind of revealed itself. Um, and I would say, yeah, I can't say I'm totally shocked by the results. In part because it's really hard to run a very coordinated interview process, and in part because I think it's also a function of job descriptions to some extent, where there's just maybe extraneous requirements or skills listed in those, and so I think the coverage is a function of maybe both of those to some degree. It's a function of just better coordination and skill as it relates to interviewing. So digging deeper is like a core skill, and having a structured process, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it's also a function to some extent of the nature of job descriptions and sort of, in some cases maybe overloading them a little bit with things that ultimately aren't sort of the deal breakers.
That's really interesting insight, Ben. So it could well be, yes, there's obviously interviewing issues that we could improve, but also maybe that just in terms of the cultural habit of recruiting is to overload a job description with a bunch of stuff in there that can't, in terms of just the basic availability of time, you can't cover all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it may well be,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I would say the interesting is the partly covered is pretty high, meaning that those items are important enough for them to get like touched upon. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like there's wholesale a huge amount of leverage in the job description in terms of these are areas that we're just straight up not talking about at all. But again, you can only recently go really deep on so many things. However, there is a lot of opportunity to run a structured process where we cover a broader set of items in a more deep way, which we'll talk about. I think it might be the next actually slide insight, which kind of reveals that there is still a huge amount of opportunity to keep a broad set of really important skills that are important for the role as part of the job description, but still run a great process and go deep on all of them.
Yeah, let's skip. So this, to be clear, is the overall result, right? So this is all of the 21 or 23,000 interviews. This is the overall. Okay, let's skip through. Talk us through this one, guys.
So this one, I added a lot of data into this one, but I'll kind of keep with the simplest message is the red line on this this graph represents if a skill is actually well covered in an interview, what's the probability that it is then well covered again later on in the pipeline? So it is revisited and revisited in depth. And what we can see is for really all of these, more than half the time, any type of skill, if it's well covered, you will actually see later on that it's covered in depth. Again, so there is redundancy here. And it's even more extreme. Like I can give you an example. If you don't worry about being deeply covered, if a technical skill is well covered, what's the opportunity that it's partially covered or just mentioned later on in the interview process is almost 90% of the time. So people are still actually going back to those same core set of skills over and over again, even though some skills are just kind of left on the table.
Yeah, I'm pleased that you put the downsides of repetition as a note there, because I was thinking, okay, isn't this a good thing? Because if you care about the skill, you want to have a series of ways to assess for it. But of course, you might have the candidate just repeating himself, right? And that, of course, is very frustrating. And if there's five interviews deep and you're still answering the same question that you answered sort of in the first one, then I can imagine there's going to be some like a residual resentment start building up on the candidate there. I can totally imagine it.
Yeah. And I think one that jumps out to me is so it's a little hard for folks that can't see in the screen share. So the first bar is experience requirements. The second one is hard and technical skills. The third one is job responsibilities, and the fourth is soft skills. So if you look at the first one, which is experience requirements, then the probability that a well-covered experience requirement is well covered again is like close to 80%, not quite, like mid 70s. And so that means, a candidate is basically deeply describing an experience that they have that makes them suitable for the role. And then 75% of the time, they're deeply describing that exact same experience again later on in the interview loop.
Yeah.
So I think there's certainly a function where for really, really core skills, it does make sense in some cases to go really deep a couple times because it's so foundational to your success. But I find it to be interesting that, you know, kind of like the experience requirement, for instance, would have that rate. Again, there are certain things where you might expect to go double click into them a few times, which I think is totally reasonable. But to have the rate be quite that high is interesting.
No, really good observation, and that is frustrating, isn't it? Because it may just be a factual case of having done this thing before, and if that's historically true, to repeat it doesn't make it any more or less true. It's just simply redundant. So
Yeah.
yeah, really interesting, guys. Okay, what's this all about? AI competency is largely ignored during interviews. So that's a pretty obvious headline. Talk us through this, guys.
Yeah, I mean, we track a lot of topics that are discussed in interviews generally. So we track, you know, what percentage of interviews discuss certain topics, what percent of candidates, which is different, right? So like a candidate throughout their entire interview loop discusses a certain topic. We've tracked a lot over time, and we've talked about some of them in other insight, you know, research that we've done. You know, discussion of DEI comes down, discussions of culture. So one area that we've tracked is just conversation about AI, and you can see the chart is kind of like 45-degree angle up and to the right since basically like the launch of ChatGPT to today. Actually just looked at the data right before this conversation. So in October, 49% of candidates in all of our data mention AI at some point. And 46% of interviews like mention AI at some point, which is even higher than you see here. So, but maybe not a surprise given the nature of the impact that it's going to have. That said, even though it's being talked about at some form, you know, again, one of the things that we were curious about is you're seeing a lot of companies saying like AI is being comfortable with AI skills is like a core skill that every employee at this company needs to be successful in the future. And there's these huge like transformation projects around that and so on and so forth, which makes sense. But we wanted to know, given all the conversation about the criticality of AI skills in the organization for every new hire, every employee, how frequently are candidates actually being assessed about that? Just, you know, asked like what experience they have working with AI in actual work, or, you know, evaluating some level of competency with AI. And the TLDR is pretty much not done very often. You know, only 2% of interviews have any question or sort of line of conversation that's like a true assessment of candidates' AI competency or experience. Now, this has gone up significantly year on year. So it went from 0.4% to 2.2%. So that's a big jump year on year. That still means 98% of interviews never ask a candidate about their AI usage or their experience, like putting AI to work in interviews. So that's kind of the headline. And then we looked at it on a department basis. You know, how like what's the frequency within certain departments? And I know the data is kind of like maybe hard to read because the slides are a bit small. But the TLDR is, you know, last year the most frequent, you know, function in terms of actually assessing candidates' experience with AI was marketing. Still low, just like it was like 1.5%. And this year, the most frequent function in terms of evaluating is actually recruiting and HR. So recruiting and HR is more than 4% of interviews have some active questioning around, you know, how folks are using AI or their experience. So a massive leap year on year in recruiting and HR, but still, you know, overall across all functions, a pretty low percentage, given the criticality that many organizations feel like this is for, you know, kind of future success.
What's your theory as to why it's so low, guys? I mean, what's the theory?
I think I'll pontificate, but then William can go. I would say there's a big difference between an organization saying that AI is a really critical skill or important thing for everybody to know, and then that getting translated into a recruiting strategy and an assessment strategy. You know, that gets translated into how roles are scoped, how interviews, you know, assessments are designed, how the instructions interviewers have in terms of what they should look for, you know, in the interview process itself. And so there's a gap between the maybe even the recognition internally that AI is like an important skill or experience, and how that matriculates into a systematic way that gets integrated into the recruitment process. And I'd say maybe related is, I don't know, how many folks really know how to even assess for this, or what they should be looking for, or how to ask for it, ask about it. So that may be part of it as well. I don't know, William, if you have kind of your other theories, but
Yeah, I think that's the case. And I think, for what we're looking at in this example, it's not like a deep assessment. It could be even just genuinely an interviewer asking a candidate, how do you use Chat GPT in your day to day? Or what AI tools do you use to improve upon your job? But I do think my guess is, and it is a little bit of pontification, is that we're just not sure collectively how does one assess for this. And yeah.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree. I mean, just again, cobbling together the theory myself right now, I just wonder whether the AI level of the interviewer, they may be uncertain a little bit as well in terms of, are they even equipped to start asking those questions? And they may, cursorily ask it simply because they don't have the confidence themselves to go any deeper. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how this goes on a time series year on year. Very
yep.
interesting that HR and recruiting are kind of up there higher than most. Again, guys, what's your theory on this?
Well, we looked at so we did look at, for the instances where this does occur. So interviewer does evaluate or assess someone's kind of AI capabilities or experience. We kind of, looked at all those examples and then bucket them into like, how are they doing that? So there's sort of 6 themes for how the conversation unfolds, which I gets to your question. So one was just, kind of asking about day-to-day usage. Another bucket was, there was like a line of questioning or conversation around asking a candidate about their familiarity with a specific tool. So, hey, have you used Claude Code or Cursor, et cetera, from a coding perspective? A line of conversation question around like workflow integration. So how what workflows have you built with AI? There's a big bucket is around like software development. So how to use AI within software development. And then like really tactical questions around, how do you prompt? Tell me about how you make a prompt that's really effective. And so if you think about those buckets, day-to-day usage and familiarity with specific tools, there's been just such an incredibly strong rise in, at least from our vantage point, maybe we're a little biased, but use of AI within the recruiting function and HR, I think in general. What we see, which is really, really cool and very inspiring actually, is there's a lot of our customers, or a non-trivial number, where the chief people officer, who's like we're very close with, it's a kind of key stakeholder of ours, has this really important mandate that's not just within their function. So they play this very central role in driving AI transformation of the organization, because AI transformation is also about talent, it's about upskilling, it's about hiring, it's about change management and communication. And so it's very, very top of mind for these folks. And so I think that might be part of it as well. And what we've seen is actually some a number of our customers, these are large public companies, their use of BrightHire, as an example, is becomes sort of almost like one of the early wins that they use to demonstrate, how AI can be applied, in a workflow, in a function, in ways that add value. So I just think that there's a real big focus within HR and recruiting on AI for a few different reasons. There's some practical tools that folks are adopting, and so it would probably lead to more frequency of just asking questions around like familiarity with certain tools or the integration to workflows, because it is such a focus.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it might just be a case also of the urgency, right? The need to actually start to automate and to implement AI.
Totally.
I think the urgency is there. Every department has pressure, but I wonder whether it's almost become difficult to say, difficult to code without AI these days, I guess. So engineering, maybe we can anticipate that drops back a little bit, whereas the areas where adoption may be low, but it's kind of obvious, like HR and recruiting, might continue to accelerate. So So yeah, that's
We'll
really, really
keep pulling
interesting.
some updates on this one because I feel like it's going to change. I mean, just like you see the mentions go up, I would have to expect that this is going to go up pretty dramatically year on year.
Yeah, let me know. Let Ben know, folks, if you're watching this on LinkedIn or Crowdcast or whatever, whether kind of a running update on whether we are actually looking for AI competency in our own function. Is that going to be interesting for you? Let us know in the comments. Okay, let's keep going. Right, what are we looking at here? Next steps. Is this advice, guys? Is this what you're suggesting we companies start doing given the research?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that are pretty practical. Actually, one thing that we didn't touch on in one of the earlier slides, which relates to one of these pieces of advice, was about depth of coverage. So one of the things that we saw, just to go back to like the earlier conversation, was, as we said, we looked at whether a topic was discussed. We didn't look at why or what the impetus was originally when we measured coverage, but then ultimately we did look at, what was the impetus for this topic being covered, this skill. And so one of the things we saw that skills that weren't explicitly asked about were only covered in depth 1.6% of the time, which seems really obvious, but just like let that sink in. Basically, if you don't ask directly about a skill, or you're not likely to be covering it in depth. It's unlikely that a candidate is going to, on their own behest, bring it up and you're going to have a deep conversation about it, or it's going to come up organically. And so if you really, really care about running a kind of a deep assessment, and there's things, skills, experiences, qualifications that you think are really important, you should have a structured interview plan with specific questions to assess for it, which also relates to the AI conversation, right? If AI is a really critical skill for everybody in your company to have in the future, you should be asking about it directly, because it's unlikely that you're going to actually get a great sense for it and cover it in depth if you don't. So that's definitely one key takeaway: is structured hiring, interview guides, and being really organized in terms of what folks focus on. Yeah, that's one.
Quick one, Ben. Just to make sure we're aligned on terminology. When you say structured interview process, am I understanding that this means that you've just organized the different ranks of interviewers to target certain things, right? So you're not just like shoveling a candidate through a bunch of meet and greets, but in fact, interview one does this, and interview two does that skill, and interview three does
Have a plan. Know who should cover what. Have interview questions if you think folks need those, to make sure that they're getting the right signal, and not kind of relying on them necessarily to kind of like make up questions on the fly. I know it seems really obvious, but the data is so stark. If you care about assessing skills or competencies or qualifications deeply, you need to ask about them directly, and you're leaving that to chance if you don't just have an organized process with structure where folks have assigned competencies to focus areas, et cetera.
Yeah, and by the way, folks, this is actually one of the primary, like almost the base value of having sort of an interview intelligence tool, is exactly so you can monitor it. Not to say it's there to monitor a hiring manager sort of performance or whatever, but back in the day, without using technology of this type, you can try and plan a structured interview process, but there's no guarantee that hiring managers would adhere to that. And I can just recall scenarios where people have just kind of, hiring managers might brush it away and say, yeah, of course we covered it. And in fact, like, you just don't know. So with go on.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's exactly right. But actually, there's something even more simple. We have like a real-time, we call it an interview assistant. So when you jump into an interview on Zoom or Teams or what have you, like if something's been assigned to you to cover, questions or competencies, it literally pops up. It's like in front of your face when you're running the interview. So I know that sounds very simple, but interviewers are busy. A lot of them, it's their second, it's like the side hustle. That's not their day job. They do it episodically. So just showing up and knowing, like, I'm interviewing Hung and this is what I need to cover, and I've got like my notes, like I'm going to focus on the conversation, makes a difference.
No, that's super useful. I mean, like I say, I think hiring managers need this support. Again, it's not their day job. A lot of them haven't ever been sort of trained on interviewing. Let's not forget, it's still, under supported sort of task that we're asking people to do. And yeah, this type of stuff is really going to support them to do it. Great stuff. Okay, a couple of other things that are obvious here. So continuously audit and optimize. That's obvious to us here. But again, the tooling is going to help us do that, isn't it? Like for instance, actually, Ben, I don't want to sort of present this in a negative way, but is there a way for sort of the administrator of the system to see whether hiring managers have actually interviewed according to the instruction? Like, is there a high level way to see that, or do they need to go through transcripts?
No, we do that in a couple of ways. We actually do that on the back end, just in terms of insights. We actually do it in a much more practical way. So one of the things that we do in the product, which is actually just to help the day-to-day, quality of decision, quality of hire, is actually at a candidate level. We actually do something very similar. So we know what the skills, qualification, experience you're trying to cover are for a given candidate, given the job description. And so you can go at the end of an interview loop or during the interview loop, you can go and see for this given candidate and the 4 or 5 interviews that we've run with them, like what topics or skills or competencies that we thought were important have we covered or not, and how deeply. So we actually give the hiring team insight into that. It's like an at a glance dashboard. Practically, it's so that you don't get to the end of the process and you're like, did anyone talk to William about his SQL experience? And someone's like, I don't know. But you can actually see it firsthand and just make sure that you're covering the things that you want to cover. So we do it actually in the day-to-day. We also do it in the back end. So like you can run a report and say, we hire for account executives, very, very frequently. These are the things that we should be evaluating when we put people through our interview loop based on what we've decided. How consistently is that happening or not? And then you can kind of break it down and understand it.
Yeah, really, really good. And again, it would be very interesting to know sort of the depth of coverage that a candidate is actually performed. So, for instance,
Totally.
If you're in a situation where you're doing you're at the yes no moment with this candidate, and you're going to know the person. Okay, it'd be very good to know how in depth you've actually covered the core skills you're recruiting for. Because you might just be pressing a reject button on a person that you haven't given the due opportunity to illustrate their suitability. Super interesting. Okay, that's the end of the slideshow. Thank you very much. Let's just stop sharing on this. Let's bring us back here. Great. Really, really good, guys. Very, very interesting. It's, this topic is one of those where if you took it on surface, you just think, well, yeah, okay, great. We know a bit more about interview. But actually, the more you dig in, the more interesting it becomes, doesn't it? It's like this endless level of depth to what actually goes on in the interview process. Folks, if you got any questions for Ben or William on this research or anything about interview intelligence, now's a good time to ask it. Pop it in the chat in Crowdcast if you're with us on Crowdcast. If you're there on LinkedIn, let me know if you got any questions for Ben and Will as well on this. But yeah, as they go through, let me sort of ask a few questions of my own. Research of this type, has it inspired you to do any more research? Like how interested are you, and what is the direction of travel that you think you might be going next bit of research to dig into?
Well, William and I love doing this stuff. If we had all the time in the world, we would do this full time. So the short answer is definitely more research coming, inclusive of potentially with Professor Fuller, who's a great resource, and I do want to mention him again. He again does a lot of his own writing and podcasting, and he's like a thought leader in the future of work, and does some really, really interesting stuff. Very accomplished, and was very beneficial in terms of shaping the research. So the short answer is yes, we'll definitely do more. We definitely have a few topics that we're quite interested in cooking up. Some of which are around kind of outcomes. So, we do have access to hiring outcomes data, and there's some things that you can, kind of glean in terms of patterns and trends to really help understand, what leads to certain outcomes, folks being hired or versus not being hired, and what can you deduce from kind of the patterns at scale that may lead to that. That's in a way that's not necessarily specific to a specific role or a specific decision, but more writ large. Are there behaviors or dynamics at play that lead to different outcomes?
Can I just interrupt? I can't help but think, Ben. Are you studying things like sentiment between the two people exchanging? Are you talking about speaking time and stuff like this? Does it give us clues, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
High level, there's many hypotheses that you can now ascertain by virtue of the quality of the models that exist to do so. So it can be, talk time is kind of simple, right? It's just math. We have the numbers, but now we can actually ascertain things that are much more nuanced and detect them, reliably in conversations. So you talked about some, but there's others as well. And so, previously it was like, 6 years ago when we started, it was kind of just the numbers. We have like a start time and end time of a speaking segment, and so we can calculate something like talk time. Then we could start to use, sort of NLP or like keywords to sort of understand if topics were covered. And now I think this analysis kind of illustrates you can just do much more nuanced and interesting. You can pull data from conversations that's much more nuanced and interesting, and that can be, yes, it can cover sentiment, but it can cover a lot of, sort of like almost virtually anything that you can think of is reasonably possible to sort of identify in a structured way, and then pull data for such that you can like ask a hypothesis, ask a question around it, basically. Yeah, I'm trying to spill the beans too much on like our upcoming research.
Top secret.
We have brainstorm docs everywhere on this.
Yeah. But if you have ideas, put them in the chat, give them the chat, send them to me, we're always,
Yeah, definitely. I might well be doing it, particularly on the recruiting side. I mean, I'm very, without being totally self-referential, but at the end of the day, it is very interesting how recruiters recruit recruiters. And I'm just going to throw it out there. I think we do a terrible job. I think ultimately we throw out all of the competencies that we then coach other people to say, right? So I think we say, oh, guys, you got to do this, this, and this. And then when it comes down to recruiting for our own people, guess what? I think we just go back to old school vibe check, credentialism. I think we do a lot of that. So yeah, I'd love to get some more into that. How do recruiters recruit recruiters? Let's expand that into talent. Are we behaving in the way in which we preach? I'd like to expose our hypocrisy, I think, is basically it. But also a teaching moment. It's like, okay, why are we actually promoting some of this if we don't actually adopt it ourselves? Like, there's a bigger question to ask. And in fact, do we need to think about, removing some of those things that stop us from doing it? All right. Anyway, that's about it. I don't want to sort of take any much more of your time, guys. I appreciate two of you spending time with me to have this discussion. I got a few people actually asking contact details and so on. BrightHire.com, spelled as sound, right? So should be easy to find. You could probably, at this point, you're probably number one on Google. There isn't some sort of manufacturer of a kid's product somewhere called BrightHire, is there?
Yeah.
So Google BrightHire, and then you can get involved and check out. I don't know whether I think there's resources on the website that you can go check out here as well. So make sure if you're doing on the research site, you can get in there and give the product a shot. If you're not using a product of this type, you really should. So get on with it. Okay, Ben and William, any final words to the audience? Anything you want to say to the Brain Food community?
No, I appreciate the time. It's again, we love doing this research. We view it as part of our responsibility we have this really interesting access to data to package it up and share it and deliver insights. And, appreciate you all giving us the platform to share it out. It's a big passion of ours. So, thanks for the time. And if you want to reach out, BrightHire.ai, BrightHire.com, they both go to the same place. You know to find me. My email is pretty easy to figure out as well, as you can imagine. So feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to share more.
I was gonna say, recruiters, you need to have, don't lose the skill of trying to figure out someone's email. I mean, that's something you should, that's sort of table stakes for recruiters.
Well, okay, that's it. That's a skill, mandatory skill to cover in depth. Yeah.
That should actually be one of the tests, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's it, folks. Great having you on the show, Ben, Sessa, and William Leeds. Thank you so much for joining. I will let you go at this point. Everyone else, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this special. We're going to keep doing more of these, by the way. If you want me to, usually we do panel sort of discussions, as you know. But I'm keen to get proprietary data like this. So companies are basically are you job posting? Are you doing interview screening? Are you doing sourcing? Those companies have like proprietary data that I think could be super useful. So if I can get them to do a deck, would you be interested in doing extra shows like this? Let me know in the comments whether this type of format is an additional wrinkle that is interesting. Maybe we do this as a midweek regular if we have enough interest. Okay, that's about it, folks. We'll let you go. Thanks for watching. We're back tomorrow. Brain Food Live on air. Again, actually sponsored by BrightHire. But this one we've got a special. We're going to talk about a candidate experience from a psychologist perspective. We've got Nikita Mikhailov, the one and only, who's going to come and join us and talk about candidate experience. We all know it's on the floor, folks, but do we know the psychology behind it? What is the human need that we're not addressing that's causing people to really have super negative feelings towards the recruitment process and, of course, to employers and recruiters? Must attend session, folks. It is Friday, 2 p.m. BST as usual. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone.